¿Te ha pasado que escuchas voces que nadie... ¿Alguna vez te ha pasado que escuchas voces que nadie más oye? ¿O que tocas algo sin poder identificarlo? Tu cerebro es una máquina fascinante, pero a veces puede fallar de formas sorprendentes. Hoy exploraremos cómo se distorsionan nuestros sentidos a través de las alucinaciones sensoriales y las agnosias. ¿Cuáles son las causas? ¿Qué estructuras cerebrales están involucradas? ¿Y cuáles son los tratamientos para estos trastornos? Pero antes de profundizar, es importante entender qué es la percepción. Pues la percepción es el proceso mediante el cual los seres humanos interpretan y organizan la información que reciben del entorno. Es decir, decodificamos los datos captados a través de los sentidos y los interpretamos para poder interactuar con el mundo. Cuando este proceso falla, hablamos de trastornos de la percepción. Estos son afecciones en las que el cerebro procesa la información sensorial de manera distorsionada o errónea. Pueden afectar la vista, el oído, el tacto, el gusto o el olfato, dividiéndose en dos grandes categorías: alucinaciones y agnosias. Pero antes que todo, tenemos que comprender qué son las alucinaciones sensoriales. Pues estas son falsas percepciones que ocurren sin ningún estímulo externo. Es decir, las personas experimentan algo que no está ahí. Lo impresionante es que estas percepciones suelen ser tan vívidas que parecen completamente reales. Y pues algunas características importantes sobre las alucinaciones pues son que son vívidas y detalladas. Se experimentan con la misma claridad que las percepciones reales. Además que son externas al cuerpo, lo que quiere decir que la persona siente que la percepción ocurre fuera de su mente. Por otro lado, involucran múltiples sentidos porque pueden ser visuales, auditivas, táctiles, olfativas, gustativas o propioceptivas. Además que puede variar la durabilidad de la alucinación porque pueden ser breves o persistir durante largos periodos. Y tiene un impacto emocional porque generan miedo, angustia o incluso fascinación dependiendo de la naturaleza de la alucinación. Como ya lo había mencionado antes, las alucinaciones pueden afectar cualquier modalidad sensorial y están relacionados con diferentes áreas cerebrales. Y pues ahora mismo veremos cuáles son los sentidos que pueden ser afectados por las alucinaciones y qué áreas cerebrales se ven involucradas. Comenzando con las alucinaciones visuales. Creo que estas son las más conocidas por todo el mundo y pues creo que ya se pueden imaginar en qué consisten. Pues consisten en ver figuras, luces o patrones inexistentes. Suelen involucrarse a lesiones en la corteza occipital. Por otro lado, otras también muy reconocidas son las alucinaciones auditivas. Estas consisten en escuchar sonidos o voces que otros no perciben, relacionadas con la corteza temporal. Además está pues las alucinaciones olfativas que pues no son tan conocidas, pero sin embargo existen, que es percibir olores inexistentes, frecuentemente desagradables, que está asociado con el bulbo olfatorio. Además están las alucinaciones gustativas, que es saborear algo sin que haya estímulo externo, relacionada con la corteza insular. Y las alucinaciones táctiles, que es sentir sensaciones en la piel, como insectos caminando sin causa aparente, vinculada al córtex somatosensorial. Por otro lado, también están dos alucinaciones que yo antes no conocía y que me parecen muy interesantes. Pues la primera es alucinaciones de presencia, que básicamente es sentir que alguien está cerca cuando no hay nadie. Y las alucinaciones propioceptivas, que es percibir que el cuerpo o sus partes se mueven o están alteradas sin que sea real. Pueden ser síntomas de diversas condiciones como la esquizofrenia, trastorno bipolar, epilepsia o incluso aparecer tras traumas severos o privación extrema de sueño. Un caso curioso es el síndrome de Charles Bonnet, donde personas con pérdida de visión experimentan alucinaciones visuales complejas. ¿Y por qué ocurre esto? Pues eso ocurre porque el cerebro, privado de estímulos visuales, empieza a generar imágenes para llenar los vacíos sensoriales. Las causas de las alucinaciones son variadas, desde trastornos psiquiátricos hasta consumo de sustancias o privaciones sensoriales. Por ejemplo, las drogas alucinógenas pueden inducir percepciones alteradas, mientras que la falta prolongada de sueño puede desencadenar alucinaciones auditivas o visuales. Ahora toca estudiar cuáles son los tratamientos. Pues sí existen tratamientos, y los tratamientos incluyen desde medicación antipsicótica o antiepiléptica hasta terapia cognitivo-conductual y técnicas de rehabilitación sensorial. También existen terapias complementarias como la musicoterapia o acupuntura o meditación que ayudan a reducir la intensidad de los síntomas. Y pues en el lado farmacológico tenemos los antipsicóticos, que estos se utilizan, como ya se han de imaginar, para trastornos psicóticos. Y también están los antidepresivos y estabilizadores del estado de ánimo, que estos se utilizan en casos de trastornos afectivos. Y por último, tenemos los antiepilépticos, que son para alucinaciones derivadas de epilepsia o migrañas severas. Y pues antes también había mencionado que se utilizan la terapia cognitivo-conductual, que esta consiste en técnicas de reestructuración cognitiva para cuestionar la validez de las alucinaciones. O sea, que la persona, cuando tenga esas alucinaciones, las racionalice y se cuestione si las cosas que está viendo, escuchando, realmente existen. Luego también está el entrenamiento en habilidades de afrontamiento para reducir la ansiedad que desencadenan las percepciones falsas. También, como ya antes lo había mencionado, pues están los entrenamientos de la percepción, que son para aprender a distinguir los estímulos reales de los irreales. Pues como ya los habíamos mencionado, las alucinaciones son muy vívidas y reales. Hemos terminado con las alucinaciones sensoriales y espero que hayan aprendido algo nuevo. Sin embargo, todavía no hemos terminado, ya que todavía falta profundizar en las agnosias sensoriales. Y pues estas ocurren cuando el cerebro pierde la capacidad de reconocer o interpretar estímulos sensoriales, a pesar de que los órganos sensoriales funcionan correctamente. Esto suele darse a lesiones en áreas específicas del cerebro. Y pues la agnosia se caracteriza por puntos específicos como la selectividad sensorial. Esto significa que afecta a un sentido específico. Además, existe la conservación de la percepción básica. Esto quiere decir que la persona puede ver, oír o sentir, pero que no reconoce lo que percibe. Además, que las lesiones cerebrales están focalizadas, porque generalmente están causadas estas agnosias por daño en áreas específicas del cerebro, como los lóbulos occipitales o temporales. Y por último, las personas que sufren de este trastorno no tienen conocimiento de que lo sufren. En algunos casos, la persona no se da cuenta de su incapacidad. Así como las alucinaciones sensoriales están clasificadas en diferentes tipos, así la agnosia. Comenzando con la agnosia visual, la cual es la dificultad para reconocer objetos o rostros, vinculada a la corteza occipital. También tenemos la agnosia auditiva, la cual es la incapacidad para reconocer sonidos o palabras, relacionada también con la corteza auditiva primaria. Por otro lado tenemos la agnosia táctil, o también conocida como astereognosia, que es no identificar identificar objetos por el tacto, por daño en la corteza somatosensorial. Asimismo, tenemos la agnosia motora, o también conocida como apraxia, que es la dificultad para ejecutar movimientos aprendidos de forma intencional, y esta está vinculada con áreas motoras. Por otro lado, también tenemos agnosia corporal, que es la incapacidad para reconocer partes del propio cuerpo, relacionado con el lóbulo parietal. Asimismo, también tenemos la prosopagnosia, que es la incapacidad para reconocer rostros, incluso los más familiares, debido a lesiones en la circunvolución fusiforme. Y por último, tenemos la anosognosia, que es la falta de conciencia de un déficit, común en lesiones del lóbulo parietal derecho. Ahora bien, ¿cuáles son las causas de la agnosia? ¿Qué es lo que causa una agnosia? Pues la agnosia ocurre cuando el cerebro experimenta daño a lo largo de ciertas vías. Estas vías involucran áreas de procesamiento sensorial, y estas partes del cerebro almacenan conocimientos e información sobre la percepción y la identificación de las cosas. La agnosia generalmente es causada por lesiones en los lóbulos parietal, temporal u occipital del cerebro. Estos lóbulos almacenan información semántica y el lenguaje. Los accidentes cerebrovasculares, los traumatismos craneales o la encefalitis pueden causar lesiones, así causando una agnosia. Agnosias pueden ser extremadamente frustrantes para quienes las padecen y sus familias, pero la rehabilitación neuropsicológica y la estimulación cerebral han mostrado ser efectivas para ayudar a los pacientes a recuperar habilidades o a encontrar estrategias alternativas para compensar los déficits. Por lo tanto, ahora hablaremos de los tratamientos para las agnosias. Los tratamientos más comunes para las agnosias combinan enfoques terapéuticos que buscan rehabilitar las funciones cerebrales dañadas o enseñar estrategias compensatorias. Y estos tratamientos se dividen en 4 principales, comenzando con la rehabilitación neuropsicológica. Esta se divide en terapias de reconocimiento visual, las cuales consisten en actividades para mejorar la percepción de formas, colores o caras, y también el entrenamiento auditivo, que básicamente es reaprender a distinguir sonidos o palabras. En segundo lugar, tenemos las terapias de adaptación, que esta consiste en el uso de sentidos intactos. Por ejemplo, usar el tacto para reconocer objetos si hay agnosia visual. Además, tenemos las tecnologías de asistencia, que son aplicaciones de reconocimiento de imágenes o sonidos y dispositivos de lectura táctil. En tercer lugar, tenemos la estimulación cerebral no invasiva, que consiste en estimulación magnética transcraneal, que esta ayuda a activar áreas cerebrales dañadas, y también en estimulación transcraneal por corriente directa, que mejora la plasticidad cerebral, facilitando la reorganización neuronal. Y por último, tenemos el apoyo psicológico, que consiste en terapia de aceptación y compromiso para reducir la frustración y mejorar la calidad de vida. Y también están los grupos de apoyo, que son espacios para compartir experiencias y estrategias con otras personas que tienen agnosia.
Prosopagnosia, que no reconozco los objetos ni los rostros, las siluetas, en definitiva. Yo no veo la cara de la gente, yo conozco a la gente por la colonia, por la voz, pero por la cara. Y a lo mejor un coche, yo veo que es un coche hasta que no estoy muy cerca. A mí me afecta mucho la vista. Le reconozco porque el pelo le crece haciendo un triángulo aquí en la cabeza, así, un triangulito así. Entonces, normalmente la gente que me conoce me habla. Entonces, mucha gente lo conozco por la voz, por la colonia, Paco por el pelo, así. Mi padre porque es calvo. Pero es calvo redondito, no pepinado. Entonces, bueno, normalmente con la gente que conozco me habla, pues ya sé qué son. Porque mi hija será pequeñaja. Mi hija es muy grande. Mi hija no es grande también y también por la voz. Entonces yo estaba siempre conmigo, entonces es más fácil los poderes. Forman parte de mi vida. Y aquí ya me voy fijando, como llevéis una chavita y parece que de colores, ya sé quedando más o menos, me voy quedando en el disco duro. La verdad, me da mucha rabia. Yo soy consciente perfectamente de mis limitaciones, sé perfectamente lo que no puedo hacer. Mucha gente me dice, ¿estás frustrada por no trabajar? Digo, yo no. Yo no soy frustrado, yo trabajo en mi casa. Yo de cocina, me debo cocinar en un sitio, cocino en mi casa. O sea, no me cuesta ningún trabajo pedir ayuda a nadie. A mi familia, a mis hermanos, a mis hijos, a quien sea.
Evan suffered brain injury after being hit by a car a few years back, and that caused him to lose the capacity to recognize everyday objects. We asked Kevin what he sees when he looks at things.
I see colours, shapes, punctuated by faces, the faces of people which I really recognise, and they stand out much more than anything else. That's why I can't read words or read music anymore. So I still can imagine what it looks like in my mind's eye, but I can't imagine what it looks like, or I can't see what it looks like when I look at it. So essentially, I find things through colour.
In fact, the brain needs both the structural and semantic processing to be able to interpret information transmitted through vision.
I can sometimes pick out small components of an object, and by using memory as a reference, infer what it might be. Like if something's long and silver, it could be a spoon or a fork or a knife, and usually I'll use my hands to touch the end of it, so I know, oh, it's a fork, or it's a knife, or it's a spoon. So memory does play an important role in that, and in everything I look. I mean, I come to this chair, I know it's a chair, I don't know what type of chair it is, I know it's pink, but I was able to sit down in it. But this is my house, so I know where everything is. Before I could read music, but now I can't read music anymore. So I deconstruct music in my mind's ear. So I listen to the piece, and I try to separate the different instruments, what they're playing, so the bass part, the treble part, the melody, and then or any harmonies, and then I reconstruct it back for the guitar. So I'm not listening to something that singularity is broken down. I think we do that when we learn about anything. When you're a child and you take something apart, you deconstruct it to find out how it works, and you put it back together again. And then you have this intimate knowledge about how the object works and what it is. And I do that in my mind with things that I come across, especially with music anyway, I deconstruct it. That's my son, my oldest son, with Santa Claus. Yeah, Santa Claus, my oldest son. And this is one with my youngest son. When he was younger, he's a teenager now. Behind that angelic face as a demon child. That's my eldest son when he was, must have been about 6 weeks old, 2 months old. I think that's me. And that's Hayden, my youngest son, when he was a baby.
And do you see the details of the face? Like, do you see the eyes clearly? What is it in the image that you recognize?
The whole face. And I'll tell you why you can say I can see a whole face, but I can't see a whole object. Like this thing here, I only see parts of it. Like I see these diagonal things here, but I can't see the whole thing. But with with the face, I see the whole thing. So you say, well, how come I can't see that in its entirety, but yet I can see the face in its entirety? It's because a completely different center of the brain processes faces and processes objects. And in me, the part that processes objects, symbols, has been damaged, but the part that processes faces is fine. And that's how I'm able to recognize people's faces. I recognize my colleagues at work, my family. That's much, I'd much rather have the condition I have. I'm lucky because I'd rather have that than not be able to recognize faces. That would be awful. Not being able to see the people you love anymore.
Visual agnosia cannot be cured. However, people adapt by using other senses as complementary aid, such as smell, touch, and hearing. Oliver Sacks gives us a great example of a man who continued to teach music despite his visual agnosia. In Kevin's case, his condition did not stop him from playing music, but instead of relying on reading notes, he now relies more on hearing and visualizing notes in his mind's eye. He is a great example of adaptation and persistence.
We see with the eyes, but we see with the brain as well. And seeing with the brain is often called imagination. And we are familiar with the landscapes of our own imagination, our inscapes. We've lived with them all our lives. But there are also hallucinations as well. And hallucinations are completely different. They don't seem to be of our creation. They don't seem to be under control. They seem to come from the outside and to mimic perception. So I'm going to be talking about hallucinations and a particular sort of visual hallucination which I see among my patients. A few months ago, I got a phone call from a nursing home where I work. They told me that one of their residents, an old lady in her 90s, was seeing things. And they wondered if she'd gone bonkers, or because she was an old lady, whether she'd had a stroke or whether she had Alzheimer's. And so they asked me if I would come and see Rosalie, the old lady. I went in to see her. It was evident straight away that she was perfectly sane and lucid and of good intelligence, but she'd been very startled and very bewildered because she'd been seeing things. And she told me, the nurses hadn't mentioned this, that she was blind, that she had been completely blind from macular degeneration for 5 years, but now, for the last few days, she'd been seeing things. So I said, what sort of things? And she said, people in Eastern dress, in drapes, walking up and down stairs. A man who turns towards me and smiles, but he has huge teeth on one side of his mouth. Animals, too. I see a white building, it's snowing, a soft snow. I see this horse with a harness dragging the snow away. Then one night, the scene changes. I see cats and dogs walking towards me. They come to a certain point and then stop. And then it changes again. I see a lot of children. They're walking up and down stairs. They wear bright colors, rose and blue, like Eastern dress. Sometimes, she said, before the people come on, she may hallucinate pink and blue squares on the floor, which seem to go up to the ceiling. So I said, is this like a dream? And she said, no, it's not like a dream. It's like a movie. She said, it's got color, it's got motion, but it's completely silent, like a silent movie. And she said, it's a rather boring movie. She said, all these people with Eastern dress walking up and down, very, very repetitive, very limited. And she had a sense of humor. She knew it was a hallucination, but she was frightened. She'd lived 95 years and she'd never had a hallucination before. She said that the hallucinations were unrelated to anything she was thinking or feeling or doing, that they seemed to come on by themselves or disappear. She had no control over them. She said she didn't recognize any of the people or places in the hallucinations, and none of the people or the animals, well, they all seemed oblivious of her. And she didn't know what was going on. She wondered if she was going mad or losing her mind. Well, I examined her carefully. She was a bright old lady, perfectly sane. She had no medical problems. She wasn't on any medications which could produce hallucinations, but she was blind. And I then said to her, I think I know what you have. I said there is a special form of visual hallucination which may go with deteriorating vision or blindness. This was originally described, I said, right back in the 18th century by a man called Charles Bonnet, and you have Charles Bonnet syndrome. There's nothing wrong with your brain, there's nothing wrong with your mind, you have Charles Bonnet syndrome. And she was very relieved at this, that there was nothing seriously the matter, and also rather curious. She said, who is this Charles Bonnet? She said, did he have them himself? And she said, tell all the nurses that I have Charles Bonnet syndrome. I'm not crazy, I'm not demented, I have Charles Bonnet syndrome. Well, so I did tell the nurses. Now, this for me is a common situation. I work in old age homes largely. I see a lot of elderly people who are hearing impaired or visually impaired. About 10% of the hearing impaired people get musical hallucinations. And about 10% of the visually impaired people get visual hallucinations. You don't have to be completely blind, only sufficiently impaired. Now, with the original description in the 18th century, Charles Bonnet did not have them. His grandfather had these hallucinations. His grandfather was a magistrate, an elderly man. He'd had cataract surgery. His vision was pretty poor. And in 1759, he described to his grandson various things he was seeing. The first thing he said was he saw a handkerchief in midair. It was a large blue handkerchief with 4 orange circles. And he knew it was a hallucination. You don't have handkerchiefs in midair. And then he saw a big wheel in midair. But sometimes he wasn't sure whether he was hallucinating or not, because the hallucinations would fit in the context of the visions. So on one occasion, when his granddaughters were visiting him, he said, and who are these handsome young men with you? And they said, alas, Grandpapa, there are no handsome young men. And then the handsome young men disappeared. It's typical of these hallucinations that they may come in a flash and disappear in a flash. They don't usually fade in and out. They're rather sudden, and they change suddenly. Charles Lulin, the grandfather, saw hundreds of different figures, different landscapes of all sorts. On one occasion, he saw a man in a bathrobe smoking a pipe and realized it was himself. That was the only figure he recognized. On one occasion, when he was walking the streets of Paris, he saw, this was real, a scaffolding, but when he got back home, he saw a miniature of the scaffolding, 6 inches high, on his study table. This repetition of perception is sometimes called palinopsia. Well, with him and with Rosalie, what seems to be going on, and Rosalie said what's going on, and I said that as you lose vision, as the visual parts of the brain are no longer getting any input, they become hyperactive and excitable, and they start to fire spontaneously, and you start to see things. The things you see can be very complicated indeed. With another patient of mine who also had some vision, the vision she had could be disturbing. On one occasion, she said she saw a man in a striped shirt in a restaurant, and he turned round, and then he divided into 6 figures in striped shirts who started walking towards her, and then the 6 figures came together like a concertina. Once, when she was driving, or rather her husband was driving, the road divided into 4, and she felt herself going simultaneously up 4 roads. she had very mobile hallucinations as well. A lot of them had to do with a car. Sometimes she would see a teenage boy sitting on the hood of the car. He was very tenacious and he moved rather gracefully when the car turned. And then when they came to a stop, the boy would do a sudden vertical takeoff 100 foot in the air and then disappear. Another patient of mine had a different sort of hallucination. This was a woman who didn't have trouble with her eyes, but the visual parts of her brain, a little tumor in the occipital cortex. And above all, she would see cartoons. And these cartoons would be transparent and would cover half the visual field, like a screen. And especially, she saw cartoons of Kermit the Frog. Now, I don't watch Sesame Street, but she made a point of saying, why Kermit? She said, Kermit the Frog means nothing to me. You know, I mean, I was wondering about Freudian determinants, why Kermit? Kermit the Frog means nothing to me. She didn't mind the cartoons too much, but what did disturb her was she got very persistent images or hallucinations of faces, and as with Rosalie, the faces were often deformed with very large teeth or very large eyes, and these frightened her. Well, what is going on with these people? As a physician, I have to try and define what's going on and to reassure people, especially to reassure them that they're not going insane. Something like 10%, as I said, of visually impaired people get these, but no more than 1% of the people acknowledge them because they're afraid they will be seen as insane or something. And if they do mention them to their own doctors, they may be misdiagnosed. In particular, the notion is that if you see things or hear things, you're going mad. But the psychotic hallucinations are quite different. Psychotic hallucinations, whether they're visual or vocal, they address you, they accuse you, they seduce you, they humiliate you, they jeer at you. You interact with them. There is none of this quality of being addressed with these Charles Bonnet hallucinations. There is a film, you're seeing a film which had nothing to do with you, or that's how people think about it. There's also a rare thing called temporal lobe epilepsy, and sometimes if one has this, one may feel oneself transported back to a time and place in the past. You're at a particular road junction, you smell chestnuts roasting, you hear the traffic, all the senses are involved, and you're waiting for your girl. And it's that Tuesday evening back in 1982. The temporal lobe hallucinations are all sense hallucinations, full of feeling, full of familiarity, located in space and time, coherent, dramatic. The Charles Bonnet ones are quite different. So in the Charles Bonnet hallucinations, you have all sorts of level, from the geometrical hallucinations, the pink and blue squares the woman had, up to quite elaborate hallucinations with figures and especially faces. Faces, and sometimes deformed faces, are the single commonest thing in these hallucinations. And one of the second commonest is cartoons. So what is going on? Fascinatingly, in the last few years, it's been possible to do functional brain imagery, to do fMRI on people as they are hallucinating. And in fact, to find that different parts of the visual brain are activated as they are hallucinating. When people have these simple geometrical hallucinations, the primary visual cortex is activated. This is the part of the brain which perceives edges and patterns. You don't form images with your primary visual cortex. When images are formed, a higher part of the visual cortex is involved in the temporal lobe. And in particular, one area of the temporal lobe is called the fusiform gyrus. And it's known that if people have damage in the fusiform gyrus, they may lose the ability to recognize faces. But if there's an abnormal activity in the fusiform gyrus, they may hallucinate faces. And this is exactly what you find in some of these people. There's an area in the anterior part of this gyrus where teeth and eyes are represented. And that part of the gyrus is activated when people get the deformed hallucinations. There is another part of the brain which is especially activated when one sees cartoons. It's activated when one recognizes cartoons, when one draws cartoons, and when one hallucinates them. It's very interesting that that should be specific. There are other parts of the brain which are specifically involved with the recognition and hallucination of buildings and landscapes. And around 1970, it was found that there were not only parts of the brain, but particular cells, face cells, were discovered around 1970. And now we know that there are hundreds of other sorts of cells, which can be very, very specific. So you may not only have car cells, you may have Aston Martin cells. I saw an Aston Martin this morning. I had to bring it in, and now it's in there somewhere. So now at this level, in what's called the infratemporal cortex, there are only visual images or figments or fragments. It's only at higher levels that the other senses join in, and there are connections with memory and emotion. And in the Charles Bonnet syndrome, you don't go to those higher levels. You're in these levels of inferior visual cortex where you have thousands and tens of thousands and millions of images or figments or fragmentary figments, all neurally encoded in particular cells or small clusters of cells. Normally, these are all part of the integrated stream of perception or imagination, and one is not conscious of them. It is only if one is visually impaired or blind that the process is interrupted, and instead of getting normal perception, you are getting an anarchic, convulsive stimulation or release of all of these visual cells in the infratemporal cortex. So suddenly you see a face, suddenly you see a car, suddenly this, and suddenly that. The mind does its best to organize and to give some sort of coherence to this, but not terribly successfully. When these were first described, it was thought that they could be interpreted like dreams, but in fact people say, I don't recognize the people, I can't form any associations, Kermit means nothing to me. You don't get anywhere thinking of them as dreams. Well, I've more or less said what I wanted. I think I just want to recapitulate and say this is common. Think of the number of blind people. There must be hundreds of thousands of blind people who have these hallucinations but are too scared to mention them. So this sort of thing needs to be brought into notice for patients, for doctors, for the public. Finally, I think they are infinitely interesting and valuable for giving one some insight as to how the brain works. Charles Bonnet said 250 years ago, he wondered how, thinking of these hallucinations, how, as he put it, the theater of the mind could be generated by the machinery of the brain. Now, 250 years later, I think we're beginning to glimpse how this is done. Thanks very much.
That was superb. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
You speak about these things with so much insight and empathy for your patients. I mean, have you yourself experienced any of the syndromes you write about?
I was afraid you would ask that. Yeah, a lot of them, and actually I'm a little visually impaired myself. I'm blind in one eye and not terribly good in the other, and I see the geometrical hallucinations, but they stop there.
And they don't disturb you? Because you understand what's doing it, it doesn't make you worry?
Well, they don't disturb me any more than my tinnitus, which I ignore. They occasionally interest me. I have many pictures of them in my notebooks. I've gone and had an fMRI myself to see how my visual cortex is ticking over. And when I see all these hexagons and complex things, which I also have in visual migraine, I wonder whether everyone sees things like this and whether things like cave art or ornamental art may have been derived from them a bit.
That was an utterly, utterly fascinating talk. Thank you so much for sharing. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Los trastornos perspectivos nos muestran lo asombroso y complejo que es nuestro cerebro. Nos recuerdan que la realidad que experimentamos es una construcción neuronal, donde múltiples áreas trabajan juntas para dar sentido a lo que sentimos. Aunque estas condiciones pueden ser difíciles, la ciencia avanza constantemente para ofrecer tratamientos cada vez más efectivos. Desde la estimulación magnética transcraneal hasta dispositivos y asistencia sensorial. Hay esperanza para mejorar la calidad de vida de quienes viven con estos trastornos. ¿Te imaginas cómo sería vivir en un mundo donde tus sentidos te traicionan?